Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. In today's episode, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and its Ukrainian proxy forces. Now, today, as we have seen the Russians retake control of the Kursk Oblast, as we have witnessed Russian forces evict Ukrainian forces from Kursk area of operations after pummeling those forces and causing a dramatic increase in Ukrainian casualties over the course of the last year by keeping those Ukrainian forces in the Kursk Oblast. Again, they were operating in what is essentially open field areas with some minor settlements and some built-up areas, but very little in terms of cover, concealment, and the way to protect one's forces from the overwhelming air power of the Russian Air Force and its ground-based artillery assets. Now, what is happening now? Well, we are observing a very large Russian buildup in the area running from Sumy all the way down to the southeast of Kharkov. The Russians could be preparing for a large summer offensive with the goal of seizing control of either Sumy, Kharkov, and or both. Now, at the same time, we are observing another higher level of in terms of high tempo operations taking place southwest of Orikhiv, and at the same time we are seeing this buildup of Russian forces that eventually could be directed towards Zaporizhzhia. Now, what is happening as we speak? Well, the Russians are continuing to use its overwhelming capacity in terms of directed firepower with its Air Force and its ground-based artillery systems against entrenched Ukrainian forces all along the line of contact. We believe the Russians are going to continue this war of attrition until probably the summer, going into mid to possibly late summer, at which point we could see larger scale Russian military operations on the ground designed to seize key terrain and terrain features and or cities. Now, again, I know we have talked about this, and it does feel like we are simply saying the same thing day in and day out. And unfortunately, we are. And this is the Russian strategy, okay? It is purposely designed to simply sit back and shell and bomb Ukrainian forces in these fixed positions. And as I've talked about before, we're going to reach a point which will be essentially a point of no return for the Ukrainian military. It is having a very challenging and difficult time right now staffing existing military units and then building some of these newer military units that they are attempting to field. And what we're also seeing is, in the case of these newer quote-unquote NATO quality standard units that are being formed, like those 150 series brigades, we are seeing a high level of AWOL. We are seeing a high level of desertion. And then when these units finally are tasked with combat operations, they're not performing very well. And the reason for that is that the individuals that are being drafted into these units are not very motivated. And I've talked about this before. There are some Ukrainian units that you can trace its lineage back to the beginning of the war that do have some fairly quote-unquote battle-hardened volunteers that existed at the start of the campaign and or have volunteered to re-strengthen some of those units. But those brigades and those battalions are very, very few and far between now. The level of proficiency that existed in the Ukrainian army at the beginning of the war was much, much greater than the NATO-backed Ukrainian army that currently exists. And that was caused predominantly by a high level of casualties. Those casualties have degraded those forces, those higher quality Ukrainian forces that existed at the start of the conflict. Even some of the territorial units. If we go back and look at some of those units that were operating near Kiev, to the north of Kiev, northwest of Kiev, some of those units that were sent to Chernihiv at the beginning of the conflict. Again, even some of those territorial units were fairly well motivated units. But through casualties and attrition, those units look nothing like they did at the start of the war. Absolutely not. And that is the Russian strategy. Again, at a certain point, the Ukrainian army is just going to fall apart and melt away. It's going to get into that position. And that is the Russian strategy. And it's going to happen. It's time and pressure. And that is the strategy of the Russian military. The only possibility in which the Ukrainians could find victory would be through very aggressive ground operations. And they really don't have that capacity anymore. I think at the start of the Kursk incursion, I think the intent was originally to try and bust through Russian lines and make their way towards either Kursk or the power plant towards the west of Kursk. Didn't happen. They weren't able to do it. And instead of doing the wise strategy of just backing out of Russia and then reinforcing this area, they chose to stay in Russia. And in doing so, they suffered horrendous casualties. And then they ended up losing large sums of equipment that the West had provided the Ukrainian military. So that's where we're at today. Now, we expect we will see very much what is happening right now for probably the next 2 to 3 months. This continued bombing campaign through the use of drones, airstrikes, GLONASS-guided bombs, artillery, and then obviously the various types of other drone operations as well. So that's going to continue, and we should, as we get into late summer, the conflict is going to change, and it could change dramatically in terms of the end game. And again, we have to ask ourselves, what is the Russian war goal? What is the end game for Russia? What does Russia want to end the conflict? And I don't think the Russians have achieved that yet. And the Russians, once they defeat the Ukrainian military and things really start to fall apart, you're going to see vast areas of territory being claimed by Russia. It's going to happen. Just time and pressure. And we'll be there to cover it. As always, thank you for joining us. More to come very soon. Good day.